welcome in. Today we're going to be talking about time. Now, time's a very important part of history because the past, the present, and the future are all based on the time that it happened. Time's very important to us. The computer or cell phone you're using right now tells you the time. You may have a clock in the room that tells you what time it is. You may have a clock in your vehicle that you ride in or drive that tells you what time it is. Time's just one of those things that we really can't escape, and history is just the same. History cannot escape time. Time is a very important part of history. You probably think history is a lot of dates, and that's a major part of history. But I would argue that it's not all of what history is. But, like I said, it is important. So today we're going to be looking at how history is divided. And as you see here on the timeline that I've got up on your screen, you can see that history is divided into two parts. On the left side, you have what we call BC. On the right, you have what we call AD, or BCE and CE, respectively. But BC, the time there on the left, that stands for before Christ. The part on the right, AD, Anno Domini, that has to do with the years after Jesus was born. So Jesus is that pivot point in the way we view history, using our calendar. Any event that happens before his birth is BC, before Christ. Any event that happens after his birth is AD, Anno Domini. Again, those two parts are very important for us as far as how we view history. Now, some of you may be thinking AD, that means after death, doesn't it? No, it means Anno Domini, because if it meant after death, you would have about a 33-year gap there between the time Jesus is born and when he dies, that really we would have, nothing on the calendar to account for that. So BC means before Christ, AD means Anno Domini, or in the year of our Lord. Now, Anno is where we get certain words in the English language, like annual or anniversary, and those have to do with something that happens on a yearly basis. So Anno means year. Now, Domini is where we get things like dominion or dominate. Those, are kind of these roles where something's in control. So that's where, in the year of our Lord comes from. So Lord is where we get from Domini. Anno has to do with the year. So BC, that left part of the timeline before Christ. AD, that right side of the timeline, is Anno Domini. And again, those two parts do revolve around the birth of Jesus. Now, historians in certain, areas have tried to move away from that religious connotation of our calendar, of our way we divide years. So they use terms, instead of BC, they use BCE, before the Common Era. Or they use CE instead of AD, they use CE, which means Common Era. Now, both of those correlate to BC or AD. It's just a different way of labeling that kind of removes that religious connotation. Now, as we look at a timeline, as you're moving in BC times, let's say it's 10 BC. What's the next year after 10? It's 9. It's not 11. Those years are kind of a countdown to the birth of Christ. And when you do AD, it's counting up, counting away. It's kind of like a number line, like you've probably used in math a lot of times. You've got those negative numbers on the left, which are your BC or BCE times, and you've got those positive numbers on your right, which are your AD or CE times. So, a number line, timeline, exactly the same thing with one major difference, and that is on a timeline, there's no year zero. It's 4 BC, so the next year's 3 BC, then 2 BC, then 1 BC, and on a number line, it would then become year zero. But on a timeline, we really don't have that. It goes 1 BC, then 1 AD. So 1 year before Jesus is born, and then the year Jesus is born theoretically should be 1 AD. Though, now that we know Jesus was probably born around 4 BC, but that's a whole nother story. It'd be complicated to go change our calendars and everything, but you know, based on history, we think he was born about 4 BC, but, I digress there. So moving from left to right, in BC, you're going from big numbers to smaller numbers. Once you hit 1 AD, it starts counting up like we normally do. Now, what happens if you're not sure exactly when a date occurred? It might have happened in, let's say 612 BC, but nobody wrote, hey, 612 BC there on a piece of paper and wrote what happened. So we know, hey, that happened in 612 BC. People living in BC times really didn't know that they were living in BC times. They would have used things like whatever other calendar they had available to them at the time. Our calendar is not the only calendar in use. The Chinese have their own calendar that has their own number of years. You've got different religions have their own calendars, like the Muslim calendar. You've got the Jewish or Hebrew calendar. Ancient groups had their own calendars, the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Mayans. The Mayan calendar was a big deal less than 10 years ago because everybody thought the world was going to end because the Mayan calendar was ending. So, there are other calendars around. There have been other calendars in the past, so they may have used whatever calendar they were using at the time. Or another way that you see looking through historical manuscripts, documents, is the 20th year of the reign of King so-and-so, or they use a certain event in history and say 3 years after this event happened. So then we have to go back, figure out when that event happened to the best of our ability, and pinpoint and say, okay, this happened in such and such BC, or whatever it is. But if we don't know what year something happened, we can say it happened around that time. All right. Now, there's a term we use in history to say around that time, and that is circa. One way I think about it, an easy way you can probably remember it, is a circle. Circa is similar to a circle. It's around that period in time. So if you say something happened around 600 BC, it happened within a few years either way, possibly. It may have happened a little more than just a few years away, but that's as close as you can get and approximate that time. So circa is a good tool for us to use if we're not sure exactly when something happened. Now, you don't always see it written out as circa and the date. Sometimes you see a C period in that date or a CA period in that date, but all those just simply mean that it happened about that time. Now, as we're also thinking about time, we divide it into different parts. We come up with these words that help us say it was around a certain time, but we also use words to group time. Think if you go into a bakery and you're wanting to buy donuts. You might can go in and buy a single donut or 2 donuts or 3 donuts, but a lot of people go in and they buy what? They buy a dozen donuts. A dozen's a way of grouping things together. Now we don't talk about dozens of years together normally, but we do group them into, say, tens. If you've got a group of 10 years, let's say the 1990s. That was before some of you were probably born, which makes me feel kind of old at this time. But a decade is what we call a group of 10 years. So the 1990s were a decade. We might group years into hundreds. Now, the 1900s, that's a century. Now, notice century, C-E-N-T, cent. All right. 100 pennies, 100 cents make $1. So 100 years make a century. So century, that's where we have that prefix cent in there, means 100. We even go beyond that. We might talk about a millennium, 1,000 years. That's a whole lot of years. But, a lot of people were looking for the new millennium around the year 2000, which it technically started in 2001 because it starts at year 1. So 1,000 years from year 1's 1 to 1,000, and then 1,001 to 2,000. So 2000 was the end of the millennium. 2001 was the new millennium. But 1,000 is an important word that you need to know. Millennium there for 1,000, century for 100, decade for 10. Those are important words that we use as far as time goes. So don't forget, BC, BCE, those mean the same. Those are before Christ, before the Common Era. Those happened before Jesus' birth. Or you have AD, Anno Domini, not after death, AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, or CE, Common Era. Those are events that happened after Jesus is born, and that's one way we divide history. Again, circa, think of that circle, around. That's where we get an approximate date. Circa, whatever, just means around, circles round a certain date. And then when you get to those groupings, 10 for decade, 100 for century, 1,000 for a millennium, and those are important ways that we simply group history. Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you check out some of my other videos as they are uploaded. I'd love to have some feedback. Leave you some comments there in the comment section. Would love for you to hit subscribe so you can check out all my videos as I talk about world history. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.